Welcome folks, this is The Last Hike. Today I'm telling you about a young couple from Texas who spent an afternoon on the floor of Death Valley feeling perfectly fine, while something far worse than discomfort was already happening to them. This young man had worked outdoors in Texas heat for a living and had spent years of hard days in the sun. But dry air does not feel like anything at all, and by the end you'll see how merciless and brutal that valley can really be. It was the 20th of July, 2017, in Death Valley National Park, on an unpaved track called the West Side Road that runs 40 miles along the western side of the valley floor, much of it near or below sea level, where a young couple from Beaumont, Texas were standing beside a rental car with 2 flat tires and 1 spare. The forecast for the valley floor that day had temperatures rising well into the 110s, and out on the open salt, the exposed ground could become far hotter than the air. There was no reliable cell service on that stretch of road, neither phone produced a successful call for help, and there was no other vehicle in sight. By the time they were found, the 2 of them were miles apart, and neither one was anywhere near the car. Their names were Colby Trahan and Kristen Doucette, both 26, from Beaumont, Texas, on the industrial edge of the Gulf Coast. They had been together about 4 years and had talked about getting married without doing anything about it. Colby was an apprentice lineman for an electric cooperative, which meant his working life was spent on poles and in bucket trucks through Southeast Texas summers. That is years of occupational exposure to heat, the kind of work where a crew is soaked through by 9 in the morning and a cooler lives in the truck. He had also sat through the heat stress training those crews get every spring, and a foreman on his crew later described him as somebody who took it seriously. Kristen worked as a pharmacy technician, and her sister later described her to investigators as the more cautious of the 2, the one who checked things twice. People who knew them did not describe either of them as unusually adventurous, and 2 of them told investigators the pair took 1 big trip a year and spent the rest of it at cookouts. None of the people investigators spoke to described this trip as out of character. It was 2 weeks off work and a route on a map. The trip west was their first time out of the South together. They saved for it in an ordinary way, put a route on paper, booked cheap motels, and left Beaumont with the car loaded. Neither of them had ever seen a desert, and investigators found no surviving note or message in which either of them raised any concern about the heat. That is not naivety. It is the ordinary starting position of somebody who has never stood on that ground. Much of the surviving record of the trip comes from photographs recovered from the phone left in the car and copies later provided by their families, and it reads like every road trip anybody has ever taken. There was a photograph of a loaded car in a driveway in Beaumont with the sun barely up. There were pictures from a motel in West Texas, a diner in New Mexico, a viewpoint in Arizona with both of them squinting. There was a photograph of the rental, a mid-sized sedan they had picked up because it was cheaper than flying, with a note written under it somewhere about the air conditioning being the most important feature on the car. There was a photograph of a cooler in the back seat with bottled water stacked in it, taken somewhere in Texas, which is the sort of detail that matters later. There was another of a motel receipt with a running total written on the back of it. And there was one from the day before, taken at a sign on the way into the park, the famous one that gives the elevation as below sea level, with Kristen standing beside it holding a bottle of water up for the camera. A photograph posted publicly that day carried a caption saying, "It did not even feel that hot." Anybody who has been out there in July knows why it did not. And knowing why is the reason that photograph is hard to look at now. Dry heat lies to you in a way that wet heat never does, and I need you to understand exactly how before we go any further, because it's the whole reason this ends the way it does. Here is the part that gets people who really do know heat. In Southeast Texas, the humidity sits near saturation, so sweat has nowhere to go and you wear it. You are wet, you are miserable, and the discomfort tells you how hard your body is working. Out on the floor of Death Valley in July, the humidity can drop into single digits, and sweat can evaporate so quickly that a person may barely notice it. You may stay surprisingly dry. Your shirt may stay dry. The same temperature can feel less oppressive than humid heat, even while the body is under enormous strain. And the entire time, thirst alone is not a reliable plan for replacing the fluid being lost during prolonged exposure like that, with none of the soaking to signal it. There is a second half to it that is worse. When the air and the surrounding surfaces are hotter than skin, convection and radiation can stop helping and may add heat, which leaves evaporation as the body's main route for cooling. That is why the park's own guidance is written the way it is, telling visitors to carry and drink at least a gallon of water a day, more if they are active, and to stay with a vehicle if it breaks down. A person can lose enormous amounts of fluid through sweating in those conditions. Once severe heat illness develops, deterioration can become rapid. Core temperature rises, the body's ability to shed heat can fail, sweating may diminish or may carry on, and confusion and impaired judgment can appear, sometimes before a person realizes how sick they have become. The whole thing can turn from a bad afternoon into a medical emergency surprisingly quickly. The valley floor also removes the one thing every hot place people are used to still offers, which is somewhere to get out of it. There is essentially no reliable natural shade along those exposed stretches, nothing between the road and the range but white ground. And the exposed ground on a July afternoon can become far hotter than the air, hot enough through boot soles to matter.
Sweat is one of the clearest warnings most of us associate with heat, and I need you to understand that in dry air, it becomes far less obvious than anyone expects.
The photographs from the last full day are the ordinary ones. There was a shot of one of the park's temperature displays with a reading on it that looks like a joke to anybody who has not stood underneath it. There were pictures from Badwater Basin, the boardwalk out onto the Salt, and the sign on the cliff marking where the level of the sea would be, 282 feet above the ground they stood on. There was one of Colby touching the salt with his hand. There was one of the two of them in front of the car with the range behind them, taken on a timer, both of them in shorts and sneakers. There was one of a boot print pressed into the salt crust beside the boardwalk, the kind of photograph anybody takes there and which reads very differently in a case file. And there was a photograph of a paper park map on the hood of the rental with a route traced on it in pen, and one of the lines drawn on that map is the road along the west side of the valley. That map came back with the car. The pen mark is still on it.
Tires are what actually strand people out there, not water and not the engine. And I want you to keep that in your head as this couple turns off the pavement.
The West Side Road is not a secret, and it is not a stunt. It is a roughly 40-mile unpaved road along the western side of Death Valley, running between the paved Badwater Road at either end, and in cooler months, it is a legitimate backcountry drive. The park recommends a high-clearance vehicle for it, which a mid-sized rental sedan is not. What makes it different in July is everything the heat adds. Parts of it can be washboarded and rough enough to punish tires, and the park warns visitors to carry the equipment and the spare needed for a breakdown out there, notes that a tow can be hours away, and tells them in its summer guidance to stay on paved roads. That advisory is not buried. It is on the park website and at the visitor center. Cell service is unreliable or absent over most of that valley and nearly all of that road. There is no reliable drinking water source along it, essentially no reliable shade, no ranger station, and nothing to walk to. On a July weekday, there can be long stretches with no other vehicle coming through at all because the people who know that valley in summer are on the pavement or indoors. In cooler weather being stranded, there is still a problem. In July, the consequences of waiting are a different thing entirely, and that difference is the margin this story turns on. Further down the same road, there is a marker for a place called Bennett's Long Camp, where the Bennett Arcand party spent weeks stranded in late 1849 and early 1850 while two of their men walked out for help, which is worth knowing only because it says something about how long that particular ground has been stranding people. There is one more piece of paperwork worth mentioning, because it removed an option most people assume they have. Driving the West Side Road was not itself illegal, and the road is open to the public. The rental agreement, later obtained by investigators, prohibited use of the car on unpaved or unimproved roads and excluded roadside assistance for anything that happened on one. Neither of them could have called anybody anyway, but it is worth knowing that even the version of that afternoon where a phone worked did not end with a tow truck. Their own photographs put them on that road early. There was one taken from the driver's seat at first light, with the track running out ahead into gray ground and nothing on either side of it. There was one of a jackrabbit. There was one of the wall of the range on the far side of the valley, with the light coming over it, and the metadata investigators relied on placed that one shortly after 6 in the morning. Then there is a gap of about 4 hours, with no recovered photographs at all. The photographs up to that point contain no obvious indication of any difficulty. The next photograph is of a tire. It is flat, it is the rear one on the passenger side, and behind it in the frame you can see the temporary spare already out of the trunk and lying on the ground. The recorded metadata placed it a few minutes before 11. It is the last photograph recovered from that phone of anything other than the car.
Picture yourself on that road at noon with a flat tire and one spare, and be honest with me about what you would have done next, because almost everybody answers this wrong.
What is known about the middle of that day comes from their own photographs, from the car and from one other party. A pair of visitors in a high-clearance truck passed them late in the morning and stopped. That couple later told investigators that the spare was already mounted when they arrived, that an offer of help had been waved off, and that the man had said they were heading out the north end of the road. They described the pair as appearing calm and said neither of them appeared to be in obvious distress or to need assistance. That was the last known sighting of either of them alive. The temporary spare on that rental was the small type, stamped with a speed limit and a distance limit, and it went onto a rough, unpaved surface for a far longer trip than it was built for. Somewhere in the early afternoon, it went. The car was found later with the badly damaged temporary on the rear passenger corner and the original punctured tire in the trunk, and the condition of both allowed investigators to reconstruct the sequence. The first tire went, the temporary went on, and the temporary failed afterward, though exactly when or why was not something the examination could fix. The damaged original was still in the trunk, which left no usable spare. At that point, the vehicle could no longer continue under its own tires. It was roughly 14 miles south of the northern junction, which left them roughly 14 miles of dirt north to Badwater Road and roughly 26 miles back the way they had come. They had 4-gallon jugs of water in the car and shade of a sort inside it. What they no longer had was a way to leave, and the afternoon still had its worst hours in front of it. It is worth saying plainly what the safer answer was, because it is not complicated and it is not comfortable. Stay with the vehicle, use its shade, conserve the water, and be visible to anybody coming through. It is a miserable and frightening plan, and it was still the option that gave them the best chance of being found. It also asks a person to sit still while the day gets worse, which is the hardest thing to ask of anybody.
It's ironic that doing nothing is a skill that nobody ever teaches you, and I think that's the cruelest part of this story, because it was the only thing that was going to work.
What the car held when it was found tells most of the rest. There was water still in it, which is the detail that stops people cold when they hear it. There were 4-gallon jugs in the trunk, 2 of them unopened. There was a paper note under the wiper blade on the driver's side, written in pen on the back of the park map, giving the time they were leaving and the direction they were walking, and asking whoever found the car to call for help. The time on that note is a little after 5 in the afternoon. One phone was in the center console, switched off, with nothing on it after the photograph of the tire. The other was never recovered. There was a receipt from a filling station in Pahrump, and a paper cup in the holder, and a pair of sunglasses in the door pocket. The keys were still in the ignition and the doors were unlocked. Investigators could document both of those facts and not the reason for either. And on the ground on the north side of the road, where the salt crust took an impression, there were 2 sets of footprints leaving the vehicle and going the same way.
Signs all over that valley say the same short sentence about staying with your vehicle, but it actually annoys me so much that people actually sometimes read it and even understand it completely, yet still they walk away anyways.
They left while the valley was still brutally hot, before the ground and air had given back the day's heat, and they walked north. That is the whole of what anybody can say with confidence about the decision, and the reason for it is not recoverable. What the ground and the recovery locations established is the shape of the walk. The prints stayed together for something over a mile along the edge of the road. After that, the record thins out. Kristen Doucet was found about 1.5 miles from the car, off the road on the salt, in the open. Colby Trahan was found about 4 miles from the car, further north, also off the road. Between those 2 points, there is no evidence establishing what happened, and investigators claimed none. The distance between the 2 recovery locations is known. What happened between them is not, and it is the thing most people want explained. Whether they agreed to separate, whether one of them stopped and the other went on for help, whether either of them was still capable of a decision by then, is not something the ground can tell anybody. Investigators recorded the 2 locations and the distance and left it there, which is correct and also the least satisfying thing they could have done. Nobody saw it. The sequence that started the search is straightforward. A visitor came down the road late that evening, found the car, read the note, drove until a phone worked and called it in, and the park's search and rescue team was moving on it that night. They had the vehicle, the note with a time and a direction on it, and the prints on the salt. Together, those gave searchers a last known location and evidence pointing north. Searchers began around the vehicle and worked outward along the indicated direction, using the note and the tracks to prioritize the first area on the ground and, when conditions permitted, from the air. The search expanded as neither person was found. Kristen Doucet was located first, Colby Trahan was found the following morning, further out. Searching that country is harder than people expect, for reasons that have nothing to do with willingness. Death Valley is the largest national park in the contiguous United States. Extreme heat reduces helicopter performance and restricts the margins available to a crew, and the work has to be done by people subject to the same temperature as the people they are looking for.
Salt out there takes on heat in a way that I don't think anybody believes until they stand on it, and it's why walking on that ground in the afternoon is not a hike at all.
Here is the honest accounting of how any of this is known, because it matters more than the story does. Nobody witnessed the end of it, and this account will not pretend otherwise. What exists is a set of fixed points. There is the couple's own camera roll, with timestamps running from first light to a few minutes before 11. There is the account of the two visitors in the truck who stopped and offered help and were waved off. There is the car, with the ruined temporary spare, the water still in the trunk, the keys in the ignition, and the note under the wiper. There is the note itself, which gives a time and a direction in their own hand. There is the ground on the north side of the road, which held prints. There are the two recovery locations and the distance between them. There are the weather records for the valley floor that afternoon, and there is the county coroner's examination of both of them. Everything else is a reconstruction, and that word deserves saying plainly rather than dressing up. Reconstruction means the checkable pieces got laid side by side until they made a shape, and then it stopped. What it does not give is the middle. Nobody knows the hour either of them stopped walking. Nobody knows why the distance between them is what it is. Nobody knows what was said beside that car before they started north, because the only two people known to have been there left one note behind, and it says nothing about that. Anybody who tells this story with those parts filled in has invented them. Colby Trahan and Kristen Doucette both died of heat exposure on the floor of Death Valley on the 20th of July. The county medical examiner's findings were consistent with environmental hyperthermia, a conclusion drawn from the scene, the temperature that day, the circumstances of the breakdown, and the examinations themselves rather than from any single finding. There was no other mechanical failure identified beyond the two damaged tires, and no wrong turn. The vehicle was on a public road inside the park and not off it, and 2 of the 4 jugs in the trunk had never been opened. The lesson is the same one the park gives every summer, which is that the vehicle gave them a far better chance of being found than the walk did. Investigators put the distance they attempted at around 14 miles, which plenty of fit people would walk on a cool day without thinking about it. On the floor of that valley in the afternoon, it is not a walk at all. 14 miles was an enormous distance in those conditions. Nobody saw either of them die, and no honest telling will claim to. The investigative record included the weather conditions, the distances, the water left in the vehicle, and the time on the note, and it did not go further than that. What is certain is that a man who had years of occupational experience working in extreme heat made a decision on that road that people with far less experience of the sun have made before and will make again.
Nothing about either of them suggests they were looking for danger, and I think that's the part that should frighten all of us, because their backgrounds didn't make them immune to any of this.
The death investigation ultimately classified both deaths as accidental. There was no indication that the breakdown itself resulted in any criminal investigation or citation. Driving that road in July was not illegal. A rental agreement that prohibits unpaved roads is a matter between a driver and a company, and leaving your vehicle in the desert is a decision the park can warn you about and cannot stop you making. The park's existing summer guidance already made the same point, that visitors should stay on paved roads in the hot months, carry and drink far more water than they expect to need, and stay with the vehicle if it stops. The park's guidance is built around the same lesson, which is to stay with the vehicle when it stops. A note is a plan. The one under that wiper shows that somebody wrote down what should happen next and tried to help whoever came along. One thing runs through all of it, from the pen mark on the map to the 2 unopened jugs in the trunk, and it is that they had taken precautions. I have thought a long time about how to tell this without making Colby and Kristen sound stupid, because the evidence does not show that they were simply careless, and the easy version teaches nobody anything. The harder thing to sit with is that experience of heat does not necessarily transfer to that kind of desert exposure. He was not a man who ignored heat. He was a man who had spent years successfully managing it, in a place where the heat he worked in was humid enough that the sweating and the discomfort were usually obvious. Out there, that feedback is largely absent. Whether that experience gave him confidence about a walk of that length is not something any record can tell us, and this account will not pretend to know. That is the part worth carrying, not the false comfort that they were fools. And there is a second thing worth saying as a general matter rather than as a claim about these two. Why people leave stranded vehicles is difficult to reconstruct afterward, and the park's guidance exists precisely because once somebody walks away from a car, finding them becomes far harder. Whether any of that reasoning applied beside this car is not recoverable. What can be said generally is that the instinct to move toward help serves people well nearly everywhere on Earth, and that Death Valley is one of the few places where it does the opposite. The desert does not test whether you are tough, and it does not care what you have handled before. It only measures how much water you are losing against how much you are drinking, and it does that arithmetic whether or not anybody in the car is aware it is being done. The record of those 2 weeks stops mid-sentence. The last public photograph investigators identified is the one from the sign on the way into the park. Kristen holding the water bottle up, the line about how it did not even feel that hot. Everything after it stayed where it was taken because there was no signal anywhere on that road. The photographs of the gray track and the jackrabbit and the flat tire were only ever seen by their families and by the people who had to look at them for work. Somewhere in that record, there are 2 people whose trip looked entirely ordinary right up until the vehicle stopped.
Looking at that photograph of her holding the bottle up beside the sign, I don't see anybody being careless. I just see 2 people in a place whose heat is really impossible to understand from outside it.
I do not tell this story to stand over 2 people who cannot answer, because there is nothing in that worth having, and because the warning in it belongs to anybody who has ever felt fine in a place that was quietly taking everything out of them. The West Side Road is still open. People still drive it every season, most of them in the months when that valley is one of the finest places in the country to be. The temperature displays still draw a crowd every summer, and the signs still say the same short thing about staying with your vehicle. Every year, the park has to repeat that same warning. The park keeps writing it in the plainest English it can find. Stay with your vehicle. Do not hike the low elevations after the morning. Carry more water than you think you need. Every one of those lines exists because somebody already learned it the other way.
If there is anything to carry out of that valley, it's only this, because out there, feeling fine is never proof that you're safe. Till next time, stay safe, stay hydrated.